Welcome to this week's Sustainable Project Delivery Virtual Training Series. We'll be presenting on documentation today. I am Kelli Polzin from Northwestern Division. I'll be supporting our presenter today and ask that if you've got any questions, please enter those in the chat. We'll work to address those as we're going through the presentation today. And with that, I'll introduce our presenter, Nicole Burman. She joined the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the summer of 2009 as an interior designer for the Kansas City District Design Branch, eventually receiving her LEED certification and becoming a registered interior designer. She has primarily worked on military design projects within the region, including several mega and international projects. Her current role is serving as the Design Branch Technical Service Section Chief, where she supports the district in AE acquisitions and the value engineering program. For many years, she's utilized her LEED training as the district sustainability manager, where she helped facilitate high-performance sustainable building designs, leading many projects to LEED Silver and Gold certifications. With that, I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelli. So welcome everybody today. We are actually concluding our series for the time being with this documentation presentation today. So if you've been here through several of these, thank you for being a part of this journey as we continue to hope to provide the good information about sustainability and delivering those projects. So we'll go ahead and move into our objectives. Really today, we're looking to discuss sustainable design documentations in the process, which those items then would be applicable to the DoD projects. As we have done on many other webinars, we have a resource slide here that has plenty of links and references for anything that you may need. Really, right now, I would also call out the ECB for achieving certification under LEED. Version 4 has some good information about maybe which credits we should spend our time and focus on and research for your projects. So that's a good tool there. And we'll see some of that as we move through our slides today. So first, we'll be discussing the high performance building or sustainable building HBSBs, a total building commissioning process, third-party certification documentation, and then what those expectations, justifications on waivers really are, diving into that a little bit. Of course, all of this is really based around our UFC, meeting that oopsie, sorry guys, I feel like there's something at the top here. Can you guys still see my screen, or is that thing up at the very top? Oh, there we go, it goes away. Awesome. So we're looking to make sure that we relate all of this back to the UFC 1-200-02. Really here, there's some references saying when we're trying to document what are we doing on our project, we need to make sure we're documenting how we're complying to the HBSB requirements in our DA. In addition to that, there are other requirements within the UFC that call out for how to track them, and then also, of course, when we are required to pursue third-party certification for Army, that's LEED. So diving into the tracking process here in the UFC, it calls out the high performance sustainable building checklist to find the one that's appropriate for your project. You need to go to the whole building design guide, and that has those tracking requirements and reporting pieces. So when we're diving in here, what we have highlighted right here is for the Army underneath the USACE sustainability tracking. Then there's the NASDAQ and the Air Force below that. What we're showing here is that energy and sustainability record card. So that is all one and the same, to just make that clear. The high performance sustainable building checklist is the same as that E and S record card if you see those written in different places. So that's the intent. Okay, so in reporting, the best practice, make sure that, not only the delivery team is completing these checklists, and from the very beginning, right, we're supposed to have these, at charrette reports and so forth. So every deliverable, you would have this checklist. But also best practices to make sure your district sustainability POC is aware and receiving that same checklist to help with any lessons learned and upward reporting. When we're talking about upward reporting, it falls on the project manager to ensure that those checklists have been submitted to each service. At the minimum, we need to make sure our MSCs have them, so our divisions have the product. And then it varies between services that we're working for. So Air Force submits those for each design submittal, and looking for that checklist in the DA would be then submitted also to their sustainability email here per the UFC. I will say that I do see that to be consistent when I work on Air Force projects. They are requesting and looking for those documents. Army would be submitting that and upward reporting it through the MSCs, and then the Navy is looking for that final design and construction submittal. And, all of this information, we want to make sure that we understand as we look in the UFC and or if any future ECBs come out about reporting, because I'm sure that there's more and more data people want to see and know and understand. So when we really dive into a project, documentation really begins during that design and looking at specifications, right? So the specifications really should be reinforcing the HBSB requirements, keeping sustainability on our minds throughout every part of our project, thinking about what needs to go in that spec if it's not there already. Many of our specs did have some updates applied a few years back that added information for sustainability and guides you back to the 01-3329 spec. So looking to confirm that that meets the product or the product you're meeting and putting into your specifications are, reinforced by what you're actually writing in there in all of those sections, including sustainability. So providing that supporting documents and communicating that design intent. So if your projects are looking after a specific type of product or, family of products, right, that are trying to meet specific goals for sustainability or otherwise, really, we want to make sure that that intent is defined both in our 01-23 or 3329 spec and in our individual material product specifications. And as a note, there's a lot of different approaches to this. The main goal, right, in any construction document is that they speak the same across the board. So this even goes for the front end specifications, making sure that there's clear communication to the contractor from both front end to specifications to our, notes on our drawings that are speaking clearly about what that intent is all the way through the contract. And one of the specifications that helps our project meet the high performance sustainable building is the total building commissioning spec. So it has been shown in a study with Texas A&M that up to 20% of building energy may be lost due just to poorly operated systems, and that's an average on commercial buildings. And so commissioning is really that effort to address those discrepancies to help mitigate that 20% of energy being lost. And taking it, one step further, been maybe a QA effort initially done to produce the building, right? Because it goes all the way through to, you know, the warranty phase. So as stated here at the top, we want to make sure everybody understands that total building commissioning is not the same as enhanced commissioning. I think the term enhanced commissioning, you know, that's based on a LEED credit that has been out there floating around for quite a long time. It's something that people latch onto, but we may not be speaking the same language. And so we want to make sure that we're talking about the requirements that we have to the total building commissioning process, right? That total building commissioning, which can look different for each project and each stakeholder potentially, right? So we got to discuss those goals with the stakeholders and think through all of this at the very beginning of design. And so the term really, and maybe that's just one of my own soapboxes, but we want to make sure that we're clearly talking this together of what our goals are. Now, projects can have enhanced commissioning as a goal, but that's, you know, that's that added on subset of that total building commissioning process. And so just to get through the rest here, I see a comment coming up, but then when we look at the specification, we really want to make sure you're identifying all those systems, make sure you're identifying those roles and responsibilities, identifying the standards that you're going to be holding, right, holding things to, and any supporting documents. So that could be, you know, a design phase commissioning plan that goes into more detail, and expectations of the contract. That could be, you know, a roles and responsibility matrix that's working through that. All of those pieces need to be talked about very early on to ensure that everybody, because commissioning includes everybody, right? And so making sure that that's all provided there early on. So, Kelly, it looks like we have a question.
Yeah, there's a question related to the first bullet note about where we say it's not the exact same as enhanced commissioning. So the question is, why not? And what are the pros and cons of having a total building commissioning, but with an enhanced commissioning for the HVAC system?
Sure. So yeah, the bullet really is focused on that these aren't the same thing. They have similarities. Enhanced commissioning can be performed, and I personally think that it has value. Just the terminology, enhanced commissioning, is specific to how it's utilized in the LEED credit, and the LEED credit has some parameters, you know, like who can be that commissioning agent, when do you come back specifically during warranty, how certain things are done. And I think that actually happens in that case in many of our projects. But RER for commissioning, for total building commissioning, allows the mission, right, and the project itself to meet that ER for commissioning, but meet it at the level that it needs to be. So essentially, you know, not every total building commissioned building is going to meet all of the requirements by LEED to meet that enhanced commissioning. And so that's kind of the justification. I don't have, I guess, specifics. I think really, you know, it just depends on the scope of your project for those pros and cons that come into play. And the biggest one that comes out to me is just having that, like, you still have to have a dedicated person in total building commissioning, like for what our requirements are, that are a commissioning head, right, which we classify as USACE. And so that has to walk through it. But when it comes to enhanced, you're having that person, a very specific person on board that has the certifications that are walking through that all the way through the process. Is maybe a quick rundown of that. But there's, of course, a lot of nuances that go into it in making that determination for a project. Okay, we have a couple more slides that focus on commissioning. And so we may have more questions. That's great. So really diving into your, well, this says design analysis here. You know, there's opportunities, I guess what I will say is, yeah, I guess let me back up. So the first thing is we want to make sure we have a commissioning team that is on board to review and to be a part of the process no later than that 35%. You really should be reviewing that owner's project requirement information, and that, you know, that's actually being developed and thought about during a kickoff and a charrette meeting, working through that whole process. And so we want to make sure that we have people who are going to be designated on that commissioning team, both the lead commissioning person and the other team members, understanding they're wearing that commissioning hat to be involved in looking at the project in that way. So here we have the owner's project requirements, and that can really be handled, again, in different approaches. Over the years, you know, I know teams have found that to lessen the burden of documents that have to be produced and get ready and verified and peer reviewed, we've looked to, you know, like Air Force's PCRs or design charrettes for the PDT to be identifying those owner's project requirements. But as an example here, you know, you can also potentially organize your DAs in a way that clearly states what those owner's requirements are. That may give some more latitude of updating those if they change as they ebb and flow. But in the end, we just have to stay on top of all this documentation and really looking at what that baseline of requirements are for the owner. And then that baseline for the OPR brings you into your basis of design, right? So the second document that you need for commissioning is that basis of design, which many of us equal as our design analysis document. So here, this is really that response, right? The designer response to the owner's project requirements, and then how is that, maybe there's some evolution that needs to be described during the design process. Maybe it's just that how are you producing that in the results that are being asked for in that design itself. So all of this kind of comes together, including, you know, the specification documents that have the commissioning plan too of how it's actually going to go out and proceed, all involved into that project documentation, you know, detailing of the building envelope and things like that all play a part into that commissioning goals and approaches. Okay, so next one we have looking at that construction phase commissioning part. Obviously, this design build, you could also have this matrix a part of that function too. But we've got that submittal registry looking to make sure we're identifying. Now, this again can be handled in many different ways, but we want to make sure we're coordinating with construction and the commissioning team, and everybody is understanding how are we going to represent those submittals that need to be pulled together for commissioning, or how are we designating that? One option could be identifying a CXA in the submittal registry, as we see as an example here. Others could be having kind of a commissioning kickoff meeting with your construction team and confirming that you have kind of go through the register in figuring out which ones are going to have to go to this team in addition to a QA team. And then we also are looking for really understanding who has what roles, who's participating in things, approving things, who's reviewing things, and so forth. So that's what that roles and responsibility matrix below shows. And then the construction phase, we're looking at that pre-functional checks by the contractor, and then the functional performance tests being reviewed and observed for the commissioning team and everybody else. And then one that's actually not on here is if your project is going after that scope, is also remembering that you'll have that integrated systems testing, which provides a lot of value to your projects depending on your scope. We have another
question. What post-award commissioning assurance measurement and verification process is done post-occupancy after the building has been occupied and operating for at least a full year to experience operation for all season cycles? Intent is to verify if season changes in system performance parameters and programming and setbacks and set points are performing satisfactorily or need to be adjusted. Let me know if you want me to take that one or if you want to.
Well, I mean, I guess my short answer is it is a requirement to test these in all the seasons. So if it's not tested during construction, they are supposed to come back, right, to test and verify that. That's part of the process. Now, it could be that it's post that, 10-month inspection, and so that would be additional that they would be tracking or have simulated some form of seasonal testing in some way. Do you have something else to add, Kelly?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is measurement and verification is slightly different, and another credit that's additional measurement going on to verify the building's operating to the design standard and could go beyond that, 9-10 month window that's called out, like in our warranty phase, and what ASHRAE calls out for coming back to hit any testing that falls in that window, right after that final commissioning during construction window to get the full seasons within the year. So hopefully that answers the question there. As far as measurement and verification is definitely above and beyond what we're talking about here for commissioning.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did not focus in on that part. So yes, measurement and verification is different. And we do touch on that in our slides, but essentially it says just that it's outside of UFC requirements to meet some of that when it comes to leads focus on measurement and verification. Okay, the other thing I want to mention, I didn't have written down here, but the ER that I'm referring to, and maybe I will write and type at the same time. So ER 1110-345-723 is that total building commissioning procedures. So there you go. So that's a good reference to have. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into third-party certification. So I'm going to be doing an overview of third-party certification and kind of where that lands and what that process looks like. And then we are going to touch on several pieces of credits, all, of course, tied back to the UFC specifically. But depending on time, we may not be able to touch on them for very long. Most of them have already been covered in other webinars, but we're talking about documentation here, so we have some information to provide for sure. Okay, so diving into third-party certification, really it has a significant role in reducing energy and water, the taxpayers' money, contributions to national security, keeping indoor environmental quality going. It has been studied, I guess I will say, before, and shown that having somebody review, an outside entity, a third party, reviewing our high-performance buildings has saved taxpayer money in that sense because, you know, before we had verification teams that had to verify some of this, and think of how many levels of employees that would be sitting in a room looking at all these pieces. It was a little bit more efficient to have a third party look at that. So I've always felt that to be a little interesting versus that self-certification. It also provides a level of accountability for those projects. So we're looking at next the options. Some of these are available to other services, and really we've got two main entities, third-party groups that work this, so the Green Building Initiative, so GBI, they are known for Green Globes, and then also they cover guiding principle compliance. And so if your agency is like Air Force, they would be one of your options for guiding principle compliance. And then we've got GBCI, and that is the Green Business Certification Institute, and they are the lead, right? They're the USGBC, you know, that's kind of, their terminology really gets all flipped around when we all talk about it, but this is a good visual to show where that breakdown really is and how that moves into the language that is out there. So lead is USGBC, and they're underneath that GBCI umbrella. They also do a version of the guiding principles. So when we're talking about Army, we're looking at lead. When we're talking about Air Force, and I mean, NASDAQ actually allows a lot more, but if you're talking about those, the guiding principles, you have two options there. Okay, so what do these look like when you're, so really I've broken down the, just to give a visualization here. This one is focused on the USGBCs, so GBCI, focus on what's the difference between lead and then the guiding principles process. So these are to validate the UFC 1-200-02 principles. And of course, you always want to contact them when you have questions or need reviews, reach out, get case numbers, work things as you're able through that validation process. But really, when we're looking at, I will correct myself, I'm sorry. These two are showing both guiding principles, in that process, the versions between GBCI's version and GBI's version. Okay, so when we look at GBCI's process for guiding principles, we're seeing, you know, you're initiating it with a form, you're getting information back from them to finalize registration in a form, and then you can submit clarifications and requests in a specific form that helps, you know, keep things organized and get the right people looking at the clarification or on the phone. And then you have your design submittal, you have your construction submittal, and then you get certified. So it's pretty consistent, especially when you get to that review phase of what we already do for lead. When we look at the GBI process, we have something similar in the sense that you're initiating, right, the project, but that's the request of the quote. Then you're submitting a survey, and then you have design reviews, and they actually look at that at each design review, and then you have your review and your preliminary report, and then they go out on site, and then you get your on-site report, and then the conclusion from that is your certification. Okay. So LEED certification. This is required for all Army projects, of course, meeting the threshold that's identified in in the UFC. And so then you would pursue the certification per Army sustainability policy. And like I mentioned before, we have an ECB that came out at the end of last year that provided guidance for LEED version 4. I do suggest that people go out there. It helps, you know, provide PDT things to focus on for LEED credits to optimize what they need to achieve that. It also identifies the DoD. I'll have some different information actually on the waivers today. And then it identifies like credits that can be pursued for both version 4 that matches with our processes and policies, but also for if it can be exchanged for a version 4.1 credit substitution. And I'll just mention here, that is a very valuable tool to understand because some, like the material credits, really are better achieved under version 4.1. They kind of, you know, quote unquote, fixed it, right? There's some feedback that they received over the years and have adjusted course a little bit. And so we are still only identified to utilize LEED version 4, so we should not be, unless you're on a pilot or something, registering projects under 4.1. But while you're in version 4, you can elect to utilize those particular credits that are allowed for a version 4.1 credit. So it has a lot of good information in that UFC. Okay, so diving down into the process, best practice really is to have a split review process. We're looking for, once you have all your credits ready to go and you're pursuing everything that, you know, you've been registered for a while, you've been in there, your designers are ready to go, you want to submit for review, which of course requires whatever your district requires to pay for that. Most are, you know, creating that PR&C and then pursuing a credit card transaction, but I know that others have other systems and approaches. But then we dive into, there will be a design preliminary review. Potentially, there's clarifications that pop up, so want to be looking out for that. Sometimes those clarifications say, hey, until we hear back from you, we are not going to continue to review. And that really is a benefit to us to try to get things more clear because they don't want to waste their time and we don't want to waste a review if we're missing information, right, for them to review. So once that preliminary review is done, we'll get a review report. And then in that report period, that's when the team analyzes and figures out what they need. Potentially, there could be some clarifications that happen in there. I don't know if I've seen that as frequently after the report phase. Of course, here you can also request and get a case number opened and have a meeting by filling out a form for them to prepare for that meeting. Anything that your team needs to figure out what do you need to provide for documentations or adjustments prior to submitting that final review. So then we go into that final review for the design, and then in the end, two things will happen. We'll get that report, and you'll be excited about everything that you've achieved, and you'll click accept, and then it will open it up for the construction phase of activities. If you are not so excited about something, there's a potential to appeal. Of course, there is a cost to your appeals. Obviously, always look at the LEED pricing structure to ensure that it's still the cost that I have on the screen. I believe it is, but you never know. I will note, though, lessons learned, you do not have to hold up a project in review process. If you have a design credit that you're saying, hey, we need to appeal this, a lot of times it's that energy credit, maybe we still missed something and we needed to explain ourselves differently, but we need these points, we're going to go after it. You can accept the review and move on and then go back during the construction phase process and appeal any credit at that point too. So if you need time for the designers to work on it, you know, you have that as an option and you do not have to hold up the construction phase of that. Are there any other comments that I need to address, Kelly, or are we still good in the chat?
Still good.
Okay. Awesome. So lead documentation. So in general, we want to make sure we remember that some forms have linked information, or that information will be verified by the reviewers and they will send clarifications or request changes, adjustments if they don't match for some reason. And so we're wanting to make sure, you know, like your numbers of employees, so your FTEs or visitors, right? The male and female ratios, things like that that are linked together, your lead boundary and so forth, which we'll talk about later. All of that should be matching throughout the project. And then the blue fields in the form are fillable. Forms do expand, so make sure that when you first look at it, it may look really simple, but once you start picking your options, it'll expand into what data you need to provide and so forth. And then lead updates their supporting documentation. And so you want to make sure that when you're starting that documentation, you're pulling down the most recent information, spreadsheets and so forth from the credit library online. And then a lot of times, so when you're working this, they have consolidated to be, you know, one large spreadsheet. I know with the material credits, that one spreadsheet covers, and you can input information in one location, and it covers all of those material credits, right? So that's actually really helpful to be able to work something and see how it's coming out as you design and work your project, instead of having, you know, 5 different things that you have to open, confirm, and work through. So upload supporting documents and make sure it's an acceptable format for the reviewing abilities. And then there's another general understanding. There is potential for licensed professional exemptions. Typically, I, you know, don't suggest that for a team because, you know, they could come back and ask for supporting documents. So that potentially puts a team into a position that doesn't have that ready. But really this is saying, hey, you're a licensed professional, you know what you're doing. And so there are some credits that allow some leeway in that, in meeting the credit requirements. Okay, so this kind of on the right, we see an excerpt from that ECB, looking at all these different symbols that are telling us what has different people's involvement, if it's design or construction credit, if you can exchange it for a version 0.1, if it is within policy. So the chart on the left, we see version 4. Some things had changed from 2009 to version 4. So this is the breakout on version 4 of what that looks like for prerequisites. We've got 1 for sites, 3 for water efficiency, 4 for energy and atmosphere, 2 materials, and 2 for the environmental quality. So that gets you to 12 points right away that you're required to do. You're looking for 50 plus points. The ECB does calculate out to 50, though I will just get a caveat to teams when you're looking at that. That does not necessarily mean you'll automatically get 50 to start your project off. Some of the calculation is assuming that you're looking for 3 innovative or exemplary or pilot credits, and then that you are going to successfully achieve 2 regional priority credits. This is important that the team looks at this prior to 35%, prior to any lock-in costs of a project, prior to all of that, really looking at and actually trying to discern what is possible for that scope. I will say that anytime I see a project that's, saying they're meeting silver at 50 before they even started construction, that is a high-risk project. Really, we should be looking at that 54 plus points to ensure you really, truly are going to be hitting that silver mark.
I did have a question in the chat. Do you recommend registering with Lead Online with the single pre-certification worksheet rather than individual credit forms? And which is the best for documentation and achieving certification?
So I called, the last I understood pre-certification was when it came up and they made this whole brand new thing, and I went into a project and I said, what is this thing here? So I called them and asked what the purpose of this was. So it does not sound like to me, unless I'm wrong, that the pre-certification actually certifies your building and achieves the credits. It was described to me as an intention to help teams who maybe haven't pursued that version or pursued LEED before, to allow them an opportunity to have another review before they go through the formal process to work through that and help. I don't know what others have heard. So to answer, I recommend that. I actually recommend skipping over that. So not signing up for it, because I think it's an additional cost. And then just doing a normal process with design and construction reviews. Anybody else have feedback on that? Okay. All righty, so we're going to dive into a few more specific pieces when it comes to documentation and LEED, and then I'll let you know when we're going to kind of skim through all the rest that have already been covered by other webinars. Obviously, we can stop if we need to on the road. So LEED, sustainability, sites, locations, transportation. So key takeaways here. Another soapbox of mine is the defining of the LEED project boundary. This is linked to a couple of credits and is critical to make sure we know what it is, so we know early on in design that we can actually meet the goals we're trying to meet, or we say, yep, that credit, I can do that. Well, if you say yes, you should already have that LEED boundary defined. So it's critical to be working this at the beginning, right away. You could even do that as a deliverable to your charrette or right after your charrette, but we should be understanding as a team, because there's more than one discipline that's affected by that boundary. We also want to remember that, it's usually the construction limit, but it doesn't have to be, and in some cases it may not make sense to fully encompass those. We want to look at the definitions of what the LEED boundary is accomplishing in the reference guide and see how that applies to your project. There could be cases, that a project is doing additional work on like parking down the street that's somewhat related to scope, but it's not really completely related to what you're doing on your project. You may not have to include that in your LEED boundary. That's just in your construction boundary. So there's some things to think about, and especially the exterior lighting credit. You want to be doing some preliminary calculations to with whatever boundaries you're deciding and debating on. to make sure that you know that when you're finalizing something like this, you're not precluding an opportunity to reach your credit just by not knowing how that would affect that credit. The other ones here are that confirming your building information. So we've got to make sure that we know our employees, like visitors, operating hours, and so forth. So this should be a question that we all ask at the beginning kickoff charrette phase of all of our projects. If it's not in a planning charrette or something already, we should be asking how many people are working in this facility and visitors, and if it's training, that adds another whole level of involvement. So get training schedules. All of this is still estimated, but you want to make sure that you pull together your calculation per the requirements. And of course, this calculation is different. Your FTE will be different than maybe some of your code calculations, right? So we want to make sure you understand that, and the operating hours will adjust some of those FTEs, like for visitors and so forth. And then, of course, the male-female ratio, there is an exemption or a waiver to that you want to apply when applicable or advantageous, right, for your projects. The other item we have here is that site assessment, brownfield. So this could be an opportunity for a project if you do have a scenario that you have brownfield and you're already asking the contractor to have that remediation plan, ensuring that that documentation or requirement for that project is listed so that you would be able to meet this credit also. Surrounding density, diversity, credit, there are, a few things that are required here. Obviously, there's challenges to this credit before. I get questions about if this is even possible. I have not seeked it on version 4, but it has been possible in the past. Really, you're looking at seeing where the building facility is sitting, and if you're sitting in a main area of the installation, I think that it is worth looking at the requirements and confirming, what those amenities are and what those opportunities are, because you may be surprised that you actually meet the credit and pursue it. The image here is actual documentation of meeting this credit before on other projects where we had our zone that we were trying to meet, and each one of those colors represent on a key the various types of facilities and adjacencies we were needing to meet for the credit. Okay, so that hits kind of our mark of all the things that are, haven't really been touched on their webinars. Now we're moving into all the other key takeaways, key pieces that are related to our UFC. So diving into water efficiency, this is bolded. Calculate early. Really want to make sure both you have that male and female ratio waiver ready to go or already uploaded into your credits, waiting for that day to submit, but also working on this. This is something that can be done very early. It's a quick calculation. You understand a little bit about your project. You can confirm how close or how potentially not close you are, depending on what that mission is accomplishing for your water efficiency. And so this is related to that water efficiency product. And here's the EPA's water sense to reference and look at there.
Did have another question in the chat. If you're ready.
Yep.
What level of documentation is needed for projects that are not subject to third-party certification? Example being renovations that are less than 50% of replacement costs, where just the component of the building is being replaced, do we just fill out the high performance sustainable building tracking sheet?
Yeah, so when you're not meeting those other thresholds, you technically, or you most likely, are not also meeting the same threshold to require HVSB checklist. So I have used a form of that checklist to make sure that the contracts both know on a smaller renovation what we're actually trying to pursue. So what's that intent again? But it's not necessary to use. What I've seen done and what I tell teams is, that's where our DA comes into a key contributor here. This is our documentation of how we meet this. So if your projects ever go through an evaluation by ASA and headquarters, they're going to be looking at your DA to understand what did you do and why did you do it. So obviously document why you don't meet those thresholds to do third party and so forth. But then on this specifically, I would be putting in the calculation. So whatever meets the UFC, pulling that up in the interpretation of the requirement in addition to, for Army, right, the Army sustainability policy. And so I would be answering essentially every one of those pieces in your DA saying, this is how we met it, or we didn't meet it because, the scope of the project did not modify, right, for renovation. This was not modified during this renovation, right? So I think that's explanation enough to say that that was not part of the scope. Hopefully that helps. Did you have anything else, Kelly, pertaining to that question?
No, I think that answers it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so more water elements here. There's opportunities. There's always opportunities, right, for innovative technology. Just trying to see when that's an appropriate time to pursue that and work that. If you've been around for a little while, you know the story about waterless urinals. That was not popular, and so Army no longer requires waterless urinals. So that may not be your best approach for the innovative wastewater technologies, but there's other ones that should be discussed and thought about when you're looking for opportunities here on your project. In the water use reduction, this is the one where I'm talking about that calculation. You can dive into that pretty quickly. Of course, this is where that waiver gender ratio comes into play and will have to be uploaded. You can find that on the Whole Building Design Guide website. And then, this is where you also can consider or understand, right, what's not considered and what's included and what's not included in that calculation. Sometimes we have confusion on which things would be a part of that and potentially assumptions without doing those calculations and ruling a credit out prior to being actually achieved. Diving into the energy and atmosphere, fundamental and enhanced commissioning. So we've talked about this a lot today in that terms, but really we're looking to make sure you document things clearly and make sure that you have in your contract what you need to achieve these parameters. Fundamental should be fairly straightforward. There's less required by lead for that. Specifically, it aligns with our requirements. And then that enhanced, as we discussed before, we want to make sure that if you are pursuing that and you know your total building commissioning efforts really align closely with the enhanced commissioning, you want to double check those small nuances and rules in the credit specifically to make sure that you don't rule yourself out from meeting that credit. Other things we have here is that building metering. So this is also something to look into. I would say every project really should be looking into this and talking to your installation about it, but does not necessarily mean that we're going to meet it on every project. So you want to make sure that you're looking at what those requirements are. I think this is where that, as we talked about before, the measurement and verification part of it comes into play. There are some additional requirements in the credit that may or may not be a part of the building scope or be feasible for the installation. And we also try not to obligate the government to anything in the future that, you know, would cost money to do. So we want to keep that in mind, but Army does have a sub-metering requirement per, and actually I need to update that. I did not see that. What used to be called ASHRAE 189.1 is IGCC, so that international green code essentially is now what's replaced that, but that has requirements in there. And then green power and carbon offset. So that is specifically identified as not allowed to be purchased with MILCON dollars. So we understand our approach or not ability to do that for our credits there. Energy performance. So we've got 4 minutes left. I just want to make sure I'm understanding where we are. There's a lot of information here. This is a rabbit hole that we could go down. But in the end, we want to make sure when you're looking and documenting the credit that you're understanding both what's required by the UFC and policies, but then what's actually required for the credit itself. And I will actually say that this visual over here to me is a little bit more helpful in that sense. So bottom line, you cannot assume that your project is meeting the high performance sustainable building 30% reduction is going to equally meet it in terms of lead reduction in points. So 30% for high performance in our UFC does not equal 30% on lead. They are calculating things slightly differently. One's based off of cost, which changes things. And so really, I would go down, you know, a handful of points as this is what I'm actually tracking, and then put several in maybe if you think you can really achieve it, so that your teams are not trying to pursue credits or maybe not actively looking for additional credits to meet LEED Silver because you've got, you know, potentially 5 points that aren't achievable, we just don't know it yet, built up and put into the energy credit itself. So we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. Okay. So I just spoke actually last week about materials. This one's really focused on, well, when we talked about last week, so I'm not going to go over it this week. We've got a webinar that's online or in our team that will cover all of that. So we've got to keep in mind the storage collection requirements and then what are we looking for in our products, making sure we're doing our construction demolition of 60%. All of this stuff, you know, needs to be documented either by design, obviously it's design credit, or by the contractor and monitored in your e-notebook. That is the key notebook that we should be looking at during construction to confirm how everything is going and what that impact is to LEED certification. And I'm going to go on down here. Take a look at your innovation options, pilot projects, exemplary performance, look at that early. Make sure your zip code is right before you finish registering. That dictates your regional priority credits. You are limited to 4. They have more options than 4, so pick which ones you'll be successful at. But with just 1 minute left, I wanted to just touch on exemptions and waivers. We get questions about this. Bottom line is we've got a couple things happening. We've got a UFC and codes that we need to comply with, and then we also have Army sustainability policy. If at any point that you aren't meeting our UFC and the Army policy, that will be routed in two ways, and that's what we're looking at underneath the waivers, Army SEC policy. You'll have to route that both to, and it can be the same memo and information, but you'll be routing that to through the Army command process, so from the garrison side, and then rerouting that to the Chief Engineering Construction Division for headquarters. Headquarters will wait to hear from the ASA or from, to confirm that that waiver has been approved prior to approving the waiver for the UFC, because those are two separate things. Now, of course, if it's only a UFC requirement, it's not listed in the Army policy, that is its separate thing and can be submitted as it's listed right there at the top there under waivers through that process and through the typical waiver request site. So with all of that, when we're talking in lieu of documentation, I know I'm over a minute, I will just say at the bottom there, there's a lot more detail that goes into it. Obviously, we want to make sure that you're detailing all your justification, so that's where things you're writing in your DA come into play and so forth. But that's critical to have ready or to add to for justification of why you're not meeting a point or requirement. And then that is all for a technical side attached to those memos that get distributed down those paths. And to note that cost is not a sufficient reason for a waiver for sustainability. So that's why at the top I have, it needs to occur as soon as you expect the failure, but ideally before that 35% lock. So I will stop. I know that was really fast at the end. What do we have in the chat?
I think we've covered all of the questions, so
awesome.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Sorry that was really quick at the end there, but yeah, if you have any additional questions coming out, please, reach out to us and we can route it to the right person if we're not the ones. The webinars all are located on our MS Teams. It's also in a YouTube link, but then we can also send out this. I believe Jensen or somebody from headquarters sends this out. So I'll make sure that we get this out to you if you need that. So, all righty. Thank you, everybody.